I want to welcome you now to the second week of the reading of God's Word. Brother Tim has brought us through chapters 1 through 23 of Genesis, and there is a lot happened there. He's brought us from the creation to the fall of man, to the flood, to Abraham. And now we pick up here in chapter 24 of Genesis, and this is Abraham now deciding that he wants to send a servant back to his homeland in Mesopotamia to get a bride for Isaac. There's a lot of story here. There's just too much to go into, but the idea here is Abraham does not want the bride from Canaan, none of the Canaanite daughters, because why? They would bring idols with them, and that would be against God's rules. This idolatry is going to go a long ways into the history of Israel as we continue to go all the way through all the prophets and everything, the whole thing. So we've got to be really careful. Here we have Abraham now wanting to send his servant. And one of the things to notice in this first chapter here, 24, is that the servant gets to Mesopotamia, and what is the first thing he does? He prays. He does not know who he's looking for. He doesn't really know where he's looking, other than he is in the land of Mesopotamia. He turns out he's in the city of Nahor. It is Nahor that he finds, the father of Rebekah, and the brother Layman. So now we've got when we get into that, remember that name. That he's going to be Laban is going to be a big player in Jacob's life as a little bit later on. So anyway, we see where the servant now discovers Rebekah, brings Rebekah back in chapter 24, and Isaac and Rebekah are married. Now we pick up in chapter 25. Chapter 25 is where Abraham dies in the first 10 chapters of the discussion of that. And then we also have then the descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael, of course, is the son of Hagar, who is Sarah's Egyptian maid. This is going to be an issue with Israel, too, for a very, very long time. These are going to be enemies of Israel. We'll read a lot of history about that. So Israel actually marries the daughters of Canaan, and he settles in a land away from them. It's actually in the land of Edom. Edom is south and east of the nation of Israel, what will be the nation of Israel way later on. So that's going to be an issue. Moses will run into them as they try to leave the wilderness, moving up on the King's Highway, actually east of the Jordan River, and he'll wind up running into Edom, and Edom will refuse them going through. So that's in Numbers chapter 20. So that's going to be a big issue there. So we have 25 is pretty busy, and we get the descendants then of Ishmael. Chapter 26, we move into God's covenant with Isaac. Isaac is forbidden to go into Egypt for whatever reason. He said, "You will stay in this land of Canaan. Do not go to Egypt." He's already taken. There's going to be a plan that God has already taken an issue here. Abraham will have already gone to Egypt, and he's had issues down there as well, and so that's Egypt is going to be a big player down the road as well. So Isaac stays in Canaan, and he has a long discussion, verses 7 through 33, where he has a lot of interaction with Abimelech, who is the king of the Philistines. Then in chapter 20, verse 24, God reiterates the covenant of Isaac for the promised land. This is something that he is really working toward. God is working toward it now, not these players. God's got a plan a lot bigger than the players, a lot bigger than you and I. God's plan is very powerful here. So Esau winds up marrying Judith. He moves south, and there is a problem going to develop with that later on. So that's the first day of our reading. We get into the second day of our reading here, chapters 27 through 30 and of Genesis. And we see now that Jacob, the deceiver, now steals Esau's blessing. And in this chapter here, we find out that Rebekah is not exactly innocent in her own right. She is the one that instigates Jacob into pretending to be Esau. Isaac sends Esau into the field to get game. He said, I would like for you to go and shoot some game and prepare for me a savory dish as he loved. So while Esau's out, Rebekah puts Jacob up to deceiving Isaac, and he receives Esau's blessing. Esau and Isaac eventually they figure out what's going on. And Esau is Isaac tears his clothes. He's bad. He's upset. And Esau, he vows to kill Jacob. So Rebekah, Jacob's mother and Esau's mother, she hears this. She discovers the plan of Esau. So she sends Jacob away until I call you back, she said. And so she sent him to her brother Laban. Okay, so Laban shows back up again. So here we go with Jacob fleeing. And he goes, one of the things he does, the first place he goes is to Bethel. And when he gets to Bethel, he has the altar there. And this is the same place where Abraham had already built an altar to the Lord and called on the Lord right there in the first time that he had done that in the land of Canaan. So this is a very special place. Bethel means, the name itself, Bethel, means house of God. This is not to be confused with Bethlehem, which means house of bread. That's two different places and two different meanings. So we want to separate those two. And in verses 14 through 22, again, the covenant is restated. And this is the same place again. We would say that this is where Abraham had called on God. It takes us into chapter 29. Jacob meets Laban. It's his uncle and the brother then of Rebekah. This is a long time development here. This is going to be 20 years where Jacob works 7 years for Rebekah, only he finds out that he's married Leah. This is a deception of Laban. So then he has to work 7 more years for Rachel. So he's got now Leah and Rachel. And then he worked 6 more years. So a total of 20 years he spent with Laban. And the 6 years he worked for the herd that he had been able to develop. And there's a long story in how he basically stole the herd of Laban. And so at the end of the chapter here, we have now Jacob with his wives and his wives' maids, their nurses, and he begins to have children with Leah first. She's going to have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. These are major sons. Reuben, Levi, and Judah are a lot more important than Simeon is. Simeon is going to, he's got a little bit of a part, but eventually he'll be absorbed into Judah when they get to the promised land, which takes us to chapter 30. And the 30 here we have all of the different sons and the restating of all of these sons. And so we see that, Rachel is not going to have any sons for a while. So she gives Jacob Bilhah, her nurse, and Bilhah has Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah, in turn, after the first 4, Leah then has 2 more, and that is, Leah's maid, Zilpah, has Gad and Asher. Then Leah has Issachar and Zebulun. And then there is a sister named Dinah. So we'll see Dinah here very shortly as well. So then finally the sons are from Rachel. The one son that she's able to get is, of course, Joseph, major player in God's plan. Joseph winds up in Egypt. We know that we'll get to that story before too long. So want to understand this is Rachel. Rachel would eventually have one more, and that would be the full 12 sons. So Jacob the deceiver has out-deceived Laban the deceiver, and now has left Mesopotamia, headed back towards the Canaan area where Isaac is. So those will take you through the Monday and Tuesday readings. I want you to stay with that, look into it further, and may God bless the reading of His Word.